98%. That single number tells the entire story. Even before we unpack it, even before we explain how we got here, even before we talk about what comes next, 98% of men are rejecting all women, rejecting dating, rejecting relationships, rejecting marriage, rejecting cohabitation, rejecting tolerance, and rejecting the social contract they were told they were morally obligated to uphold. This video is about how that happened, why it is happening right now at this scale, and why it is not reversing. Stay to the end because the final conclusion of this story is not about dating at all. It is about the collapse of the fallback systems that once kept modern society stable. This video is not about anger. It is not about revenge. It is not about insults or theatrics. This is a calm, cold examination of cause and effect, of incentives and outcomes, of decades of messaging colliding with economic reality. What you are watching unfold right now is not a trend, not a phase, and not a temporary protest. It is a permanent behavioral shift. And once you see the full picture, it becomes clear why there is no return to the old model. For nearly half a century, men were told a very simple message, repeated in different forms, but always pointing in the same direction. You are not needed. You are not wanted. You are a problem to be managed, a risk to be minimized, a force that must be controlled. Masculinity was reframed as something dangerous, something defective, something that needed correction. Responsibility without authority became the expectation. Contribution without appreciation became the norm. Obligation without reciprocity became the social baseline. At the same time, men were told that if they worked harder, if they became better, if they improved themselves, things would eventually balance out. They were promised partnership at the end of compliance. They were promised belonging in exchange for sacrifice. They were promised meaning if they continued to show up, pay in, and stay quiet. And for a long time, many men did exactly that. But systems do not survive on promises alone, they survive on results. And what men experienced over decades was not balance, not reciprocity, and not partnership. What they experienced was a steady erosion of purpose paired with increasing demands. The cost of participation rose every year, while the benefits declined. Marriage became risk without reward. Dating became exposure without respect. Relationships became liability without security. As these pressures mounted, another force entered the picture, and this one changed everything. The economic foundation that once supported modern life began to crack. Housing costs exploded. Living expenses rose faster than wages. Stability became conditional, fragile, and increasingly rare. The margin for error disappeared. For men, the message became unavoidable. You are expected to provide more in an environment that offers less, while being told you are still the problem. At a certain point, rational actors stop negotiating with systems that punish them for participation. This is not emotional. This is not ideological. This is behavioral economics at work. When the cost of engagement exceeds the benefit, disengagement becomes the logical choice. Men did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon society. They adapted. They observed outcomes. They compared notes. They ran the numbers quietly, privately, and without slogans. And one by one, they began opting out. First from dating, then from long term relationships, then from marriage, then from cohabitation, then from emotional labor, then from social expectation itself. What replaced all of that was not chaos or despair. It was something far more dangerous to the existing system. It was peace. Men discovered that by removing themselves from these structures, their lives became simpler, quieter, and more predictable. Expenses dropped, stress levels declined, time became their own again. For the first time in years, many men felt a sense of control over their own existence. Not dominance, not power over others, control over themselves. And this is where the narrative breaks for those still operating under outdated assumptions. Men did not leave and become miserable. They left and became stable. They downsized. They simplified. They adjusted expectations downward in a world that had raised costs beyond reason. And in doing so, they found something that had been absent for a very long time: contentment. For men, simplicity is luxury, not because men lack ambition, but because peace has become the rarest resource of all. A small living space that is paid for, predictable expenses, quiet evenings, personal hobbies, physical health, mental clarity. These things compound over time, and once experienced, they are very difficult to give up. Meanwhile, the system that men exited continued to operate as if they would eventually return. It assumed compliance was temporary. It assumed incentives could be adjusted later. It assumed the fallback plan was still intact. That assumption was wrong. Women were told for decades that men were optional, that partnership was a choice rather than a necessity, that independence could be outsourced to institutions, that the state could replace the family, that provision could be guaranteed through policy rather than cooperation. And for a while that seemed true. But systems that rely on continuous funding cannot survive without continuous input. The state is not a provider, it is a distributor. It can only give what it first takes. And as participation declines, so does capacity. Now we are entering the phase that few planned for and even fewer prepared for. The fallback systems are failing simultaneously. Living alone has become financially unsustainable for many. Housing shortages are no longer temporary. Wages are no longer keeping up. Public support systems are strained beyond capacity. And the assumption that someone else will step in is collapsing in real time. This is why the messaging has changed so dramatically. Where once men were told to stay away, now they are being asked to return. Where once approach was framed as unwanted, now absence is framed as abandonment. Where once independence was celebrated, now partnership is rebranded as essential. But men are not responding to the message because they are responding to outcomes. And the outcomes tell them that returning means re entering a system that has not reformed, has not corrected incentives, and has not acknowledged responsibility. This is the part that is hardest for many to accept. Men did not leave to punish anyone, they left to protect themselves. And protection, once achieved, becomes a non negotiable baseline. The result is a quiet standoff that is reshaping society from the ground up. Women are discovering that independence without infrastructure is vulnerability, that freedom without support is exposure, that choice without consequence was an illusion sustained by temporary conditions. Men, on the other hand, are discovering that solitude, when chosen rather than imposed, is not loneliness. It is autonomy. It is the ability to design a life around sustainability rather than performance. It is the freedom to step off the treadmill that never stopped accelerating. This is not a story about winners and losers in the traditional sense. It is a story about adaptation. The group that adapts first gains stability. The group that adapts last bears the cost. Right now, men are done negotiating their way back into systems that do not serve them. They are not asking to be understood. They are not asking for validation. They are not staging protests or demanding reform. They are simply not showing up. And absence is the one form of resistance that cannot be argued with, shamed away, or legislated out of existence. As this continues, the consequences ripple outward. Birth rates decline. Household formation slows. Consumption patterns change. Entire industries built on aspirational spending begin to wobble. Real estate markets that assumed dual incomes struggle to adjust. Social narratives built on perpetual growth confront the reality of contraction. This is why the number matters. 98% is not a statistic you can dismiss. It represents a critical mass. It means the system no longer has enough participants to sustain its previous form. It means the old assumptions are dead, whether acknowledged or not. The most important insight here is not that men are rejecting women. It is that men are rejecting a framework that made partnership synonymous with sacrifice and made solitude synonymous with failure. Once that mental inversion occurred, everything changed. The future that emerges from this will not look like the past. There will be no sudden reconciliation, no cultural reset that restores old roles without addressing old costs, no campaign that convinces men to trade peace for pressure again. What we are watching is the long unwind of a social contract that was never renegotiated as conditions changed. And when contracts fail, people do not riot, they exit. This is only the beginning of that story. The reason this shift feels so shocking to so many people is because it is happening quietly. There are no marches, no banners, no public declarations. There is no single movement leader or manifesto. There is simply a steady withdrawal, a gradual thinning out of participation that only becomes visible once the numbers reach a critical threshold. By the time the consequences are obvious, the decision has already been made by millions of individuals independently. This is how real social change happens, not through noise, but through silence. For decades, society relied on an assumption that men would always adapt, that no matter how the rules changed, no matter how the expectations increased, no matter how the rewards diminished, men would still show up because they always had. That assumption was built on history, but it ignored incentives. Men adapted in the past because adaptation still offered a path to stability, respect, and continuity. What has changed is that adaptation now offers only risk, instability, and endless obligation. At the individual level, the calculation is brutally simple. A man looks at his income, his expenses, his legal exposure, his social standing, and his future prospects. He looks at the cost of housing, the volatility of employment, the lack of institutional loyalty, and the absence of long term security. Then he looks at what is being asked of him in modern relationships: emotional availability without authority, financial contribution without protection, commitment without permanence, responsibility without control. When these two columns are placed side by side, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Opting out is not an act of rebellion, it is an optimization strategy. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail so consistently. Shame only works when the target still values the approval of the group applying it. Men who have already detached no longer do. Once a man has built a life that functions without external validation, social pressure loses its leverage. Words bounce off, labels lose meaning, accusations feel distant and abstract. What replaces external validation is internal calibration. Men begin measuring their lives not by how they are perceived, but by how sustainable their daily routines are. Can I pay my bills without anxiety? Can I rest without guilt? Can I pursue interests without justification? Can I exist without constant negotiation? When the answer to those questions becomes yes, the incentive to re enter chaos disappears. This is why calls for men to come back often sound hollow. They focus on moral obligation rather than structural reform. They appeal to responsibility while ignoring reciprocity. They speak of partnership but fail to address risk. They ask for sacrifice without offering security. In other words, they offer the same deal that was already rejected. At the same time, a parallel realization is unfolding on the other side. Many women are discovering that the independence they were promised was heavily subsidized by conditions that no longer exist. Affordable housing assumed two incomes or a stable support network. Career progression assumed endless economic expansion. Social safety nets assumed a broad base of contributors. When those assumptions collapse, independence becomes precarious very quickly. This is not about competence or intelligence, it is about structure. Living alone in a high cost environment is fundamentally different from living alone in a low cost one. Navigating life without a long term partner is fundamentally different when systems are strained. The margin for error shrinks. One unexpected expense becomes destabilizing. One job disruption becomes existential. As this pressure builds, the messaging shifts from celebration to concern. The same behaviors once framed as empowerment are now framed as unsustainable. The same choices once praised are now questioned, and the same men once told to stay away are now framed as missing. But framing does not change incentives. Reality does. Men are not unaware of this shift. They see it clearly. They observe the sudden change in tone, the rebranding of old expectations, the appeals to nostalgia or shared struggle. What they do not see is accountability. They do not see acknowledgement of harm. They do not see concrete changes that reduce risk. Without those elements, words are just noise. Another factor accelerating this divide is technology. Digital environments have given men alternatives to traditional social engagement, entertainment, community, education, and even limited forms of connection are now available without physical proximity or emotional exposure. This does not replace human relationships entirely, but it reduces dependence. It allows men to meet many of their needs without entering high risk interpersonal arrangements. This is often misunderstood as avoidance or immaturity. In reality, it is adaptation to an environment where trust has been eroded. When trust is low, people seek systems that are predictable. Technology, for all its flaws, is predictable. It does not make legal claims. It does not impose unilateral obligations. It does not redefine the rules mid game. This predictability is deeply appealing in a world where social norms shift rapidly and accountability is asymmetrical. As more men opt out, the cultural lag becomes more pronounced. Institutions still speak as if men are present, as if households will form, as if families will stabilize demographics. Policies are written for a population that no longer exists. Media narratives continue to assume reconciliation is inevitable. But underneath it all, participation continues to decline. This creates a feedback loop. Fewer men participating means fewer households forming. Fewer households forming means fewer children. Fewer children mean a smaller future workforce. A smaller workforce means greater strain on public systems. Greater strain increases pressure on individuals. Increased pressure accelerates withdrawal. Once this loop is established, reversing it requires massive structural change. Not messaging, not slogans, not campaigns. Structural change means reducing risk, restoring reciprocity, and rebuilding trust over a long period of time. None of those can be done quickly. None of them can be done cheaply. And none of them can be done without admitting that the previous model failed. This admission is what many institutions resist most. There is also a psychological dimension that is rarely discussed openly. Many men who have opted out report not feeling angry or bitter, but relieved. Relief is powerful. It is stabilizing. It rewires priorities. A man who is no longer chronically stressed is less reactive, less impulsive, and less susceptible to external manipulation. He becomes harder to mobilize, harder to provoke, harder to guilt. From a system perspective, this is destabilizing. Systems rely on engagement, friction, and emotional investment. A population that is calm and disengaged is difficult to direct. It does not consume as expected. It does not aspire as predicted. It does not respond to incentives designed for previous conditions. This is why the shift feels so unsettling. It represents a loss of control rather than a loss of resources. The lever that once moved behavior no longer connects to anything. Women, facing increasing pressure, are forced to confront this reality without a safety net. For the first time in modern history, many are encountering a world where there is no automatic fallback plan. The state is constrained, families are fragmented, community ties are weak, and men are absent by choice, not circumstance. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observation. Survival in such an environment requires adaptation. Some will adapt successfully, some will not. But the adaptation required now is far more difficult than the adaptation men undertook earlier, because it must happen under constraint rather than abundance. Meanwhile, men continue refining their minimalist strategies. They choose smaller spaces, they reduce consumption, they prioritize health and routine, they form loose networks rather than binding commitments. They avoid leverage points that could be used against them. Over time, these strategies compound into resilience. The irony is that this resilience is precisely what society once depended on men to provide for others. Now it is being used to insulate themselves. As this divergence continues, misunderstandings multiply. Each side interprets the other through outdated frameworks. Men are accused of abandoning responsibility. Women are accused of poor planning. Neither accusation addresses the underlying cause. Both miss the point. The point is that incentives shape behavior, and incentives have been misaligned for decades. You cannot shame people into taking risks that no longer make sense. You cannot guilt people into carrying burdens that offer no return. And you cannot rebuild trust by pretending it was never broken. What happens next will not be dramatic in the cinematic sense. There will be no single moment of collapse. Instead, hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. There will be a series of adjustments, each more uncomfortable than the last. More people living alone, more people struggling to maintain living standards, more institutions downsizing expectations, more narratives rewritten in real time. And through it all, the quiet withdrawal continues. Men are not coming back to rescue a system that dismissed them. They are not returning to play a role that no longer exists. They are not sacrificing peace for promises. They have already adapted. This is not the end of the story, but it is the end of the illusion that things will simply revert if we wait long enough. As this pattern settles in, something else becomes visible that was previously hidden by constant motion. When participation declines, inefficiencies that were once masked by volume are exposed. Systems designed around constant engagement begin to falter, not because they are attacked, but because they are no longer fed. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of the moment. Modern society was not built to function with widespread disengagement. It was built on the assumption of continuous input, continuous growth, and continuous compliance. For generations, social stability relied on predictable life paths. Education led to work, work led to partnership, partnership led to family formation justified long term investment. Each stage reinforced the next. What men have done by walking away is interrupt that chain at its earliest point. And once interrupted, everything downstream becomes unstable. This is why the conversation often feels confused and disjointed. People are arguing about surface level behaviors while ignoring the structural fracture underneath. Debates rage about dating norms, social media influence, cultural messaging, and generational attitudes. All of these are symptoms, not causes. The cause is that the underlying exchange no longer balances. In any system of exchange, whether economic or social, participants evaluate risk versus reward. When the balance tilts too far in one direction, rational actors reduce exposure. This is not ideological, it is mechanical. The mistake many analysts make is assuming that social systems operate differently from markets. They do not. They simply move more slowly. Men did not abandon society because they were persuaded to. They abandoned it because the cost of staying exceeded the cost of leaving. Once that threshold is crossed, reversal becomes extremely difficult. Lowering cost is far harder than raising expectations, especially in a constrained environment. Consider how risk has shifted over time. In previous eras, partnership offered shared risk. Two people pooling resources could weather uncertainty more effectively than one. Today, partnership often amplifies risk rather than reducing it. Legal exposure, financial entanglement, and social obligation stack in ways that make failure catastrophic rather than manageable. When failure becomes catastrophic, avoidance becomes rational. This is why men are so cautious now. It is not fear in the emotional sense, it is risk management. The same mindset that encourages diversification in finance encourages minimal exposure in personal life when volatility is high. Men are behaving exactly as they have been taught to behave in every other domain. What makes this shift particularly destabilizing is that it undermines narratives that relied on male participation as a constant. Entire industries were built around household formation. Entire policy frameworks assumed stable family units. Entire cultural scripts assumed men would eventually settle, commit, and provide. When those assumptions fail, there is no quick replacement. The result is a strange kind of institutional denial. Many organizations continue planning for a future that will not materialize. They forecast growth based on outdated models. They design programs for participants who are no longer present. They speak in moral language rather than addressing structural incentives. And each year, the gap between expectation and reality widens. At the individual level, women navigating this environment face a harsh recalibration. Many were told that traditional structures were optional because alternatives existed. What was not emphasized was that those alternatives were conditional. They depended on economic surplus, social cohesion, and a large base of contributors. As those conditions erode, the alternatives weaken. This creates a sense of betrayal that mirrors what men experienced earlier, though expressed differently. Expectations shaped by decades of messaging collide with a reality that no longer supports them. The emotional response is understandable, but emotional responses do not alter structural constraints. Men observing this remain unmoved, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. They recognize the pattern because they lived through an earlier version of it. They were told one thing and experienced another. They adjusted. They do not see a reason to readjust again without meaningful change. One of the most striking aspects of this moment is how little persuasion matters. Campaigns encouraging connection, partnership, or reconciliation consistently underperform. This is not because the message is unclear, but because the incentives remain unchanged. People do not change behavior based on rhetoric when lived experience contradicts it. Instead, men continue refining lives built around low exposure. They prioritize routines that are resilient to disruption. They invest in skills that enhance autonomy. They choose environments that minimize dependency. Over time, these choices compound into a lifestyle that is difficult to disrupt and even harder to abandon. This compounding effect is critical to understand. The longer a man remains outside traditional structures, the less appealing reentry becomes. Habits form, expectations reset, identity shifts. What once felt like sacrifice now feels like unnecessary complexity. What once felt like obligation now feels like intrusion. From the outside, this can be misinterpreted as apathy. In reality, it is alignment. Life becomes quieter when fewer variables are introduced. Decisions become simpler when fewer stakeholders are involved. The sense of agency increases when outcomes depend primarily on one person. Meanwhile, the broader system strains under mismatched expectations. Policies designed to encourage family formation struggle because the underlying motivations are absent. Economic incentives cannot fully offset perceived risk. Cultural appeals ring hollow without trust. And trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. Another overlooked factor is time. Men who opted out did so gradually, often after years of observation. They did not leave impulsively. They left after patterns repeated themselves consistently. This means their conclusions are deeply rooted. Changing such conclusions requires not only reform, but sustained proof over long periods. Short term gestures are insufficient. Temporary incentives are dismissed as traps. Symbolic language is ignored. Only durable change has any chance of altering behavior, and even then, the response will be cautious and delayed. This is why projections that assume a rapid return to previous norms are unrealistic. Even if conditions improve tomorrow, participation would not snap back. Trust rebuilds slowly, if at all. And many men, having found equilibrium, would see little reason to disrupt it. As a result, society enters a prolonged adjustment phase. Expectations lower, standards shift, definitions of success change. The idea that everyone must follow the same path loses credibility. Diversity of lifestyle increases, not because it is celebrated, but because it becomes necessary. This adjustment is uneven. Those with flexibility adapt more easily. Those dependent on rigid structures struggle. This creates new fault lines that cut across traditional categories. Age, income, and location become more predictive of stability than gender alone. Yet, despite these complexities, one pattern remains consistent. Men who have opted out rarely express regret. This is not because their lives are perfect, but because the trade offs feel manageable. They accept limitation in exchange for predictability, they accept solitude in exchange for peace. In contrast, those still invested in the old model face mounting uncertainty. The gap between expectation and reality generates anxiety. Planning becomes difficult when assumptions no longer hold. Effort feels unrewarded. Frustration grows. This divergence fuels misunderstanding. Each side believes the other is missing something obvious, but both are responding rationally to their environments. The difference lies in adaptation speed. Men adapted early, others are adapting late. As this process unfolds, narratives will continue to shift. Responsibility will be reassigned, blame will circulate, but these narratives matter less than outcomes. The trajectory is shaped by incentives, not opinions. If there is a lesson to extract from this moment, it is that systems must evolve alongside conditions. When they do not, people exit rather than comply indefinitely. This is not unique to relationships or gender dynamics. It applies to work, institutions, and governance as well. What makes this situation unique is its scale. When a critical mass disengages simultaneously, the ripple effects are profound. And once that mass crosses a threshold, momentum carries it forward. The question then is not whether men will return en masse. The evidence suggests they will not. The question is how society reorganizes around a new baseline where widespread male disengagement is a permanent feature rather than a temporary anomaly. This reorganization will be uncomfortable. It will challenge assumptions long taken for granted. It will require honesty about trade offs that were previously obscured. And it will force a reckoning with the reality that no system can function indefinitely without mutual benefit. Men have already internalized this truth. That is why they left. What remains is for the rest of society to catch up. As the adjustment continues, a quieter but equally important transformation takes place beneath the surface. Values recalibrate. What people once considered essential begins to look optional, and what was once optional begins to look essential. This shift is not driven by ideology, but by lived experience. When conditions tighten, priorities clarify. When systems fail, individuals learn what they can and cannot rely on. For men who have stepped away, one of the most profound changes is how they define success. Success is no longer measured by status, approval, or conformity to a prescribed life path. It is measured by stability, autonomy, and sustainability. A life that can be maintained without constant external input becomes the benchmark. Anything that threatens that balance is viewed skeptically. This reframing has cascading effects. Consumption declines because fewer purchases are required to signal identity. Competition diminishes because there is less incentive to compare. Ambition becomes selective rather than expansive. Men channel effort into areas that yield direct personal return rather than diffuse social reward. From a macro perspective, this creates a contraction that traditional economic models struggle to explain. Growth slows not because of scarcity alone, but because demand itself changes shape. People who no longer seek validation through accumulation spend differently. They prioritize durability over novelty, function over display. Entire sectors built on aspirational spending feel the impact. This is often misdiagnosed as pessimism or disengagement from life. In reality, it is engagement on different terms. Men are not withdrawing from existence, they are withdrawing from performative participation. They still work, create, learn, and maintain relationships, but these relationships are chosen carefully and structured to minimize risk. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the role of solitude. Solitude is frequently conflated with isolation, but they are not the same. Isolation is imposed and painful. Solitude is chosen and restorative. Men who have chosen solitude experience it as a form of control over their environment. It allows for reflection, routine, and recovery in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. This distinction matters because it explains why warnings about loneliness fail to resonate. Loneliness is the absence of connection one desires. Many men who have opted out do not desire the connections being offered. They experience those connections as draining rather than fulfilling. Removing them feels like relief, not loss. As this perspective spreads, it reshapes social expectations. The assumption that everyone seeks the same outcomes becomes untenable. Diversity of preference becomes more visible, even if it is not celebrated. The idea that adulthood must culminate in a specific arrangement loses authority. For women navigating this landscape, the recalibration is more complex. Many are forced to confront a reality that diverges sharply from what they were taught to expect. The promised ease of independence clashes with economic constraint. The assumption of endless optionality narrows. This is not a failure of individuals, but a collision between narrative and structure. Some adapt by downsizing expectations, mirroring strategies men adopted earlier. Others double down on pursuit, hoping conditions will improve. Still others experience frustration and confusion as familiar paths close off. The variation in outcomes grows wider, reflecting differences in resources, timing, and adaptability. This widening gap fuels tension, but it also reveals something important. The old model depended on uniform participation. The new reality does not. People are forced to navigate without a shared script, and that exposes both resilience and fragility. Institutions, meanwhile, struggle to respond. Many were designed to manage behavior rather than accommodate withdrawal. They know how to incentivize participation, but not how to operate when participation declines. Their tools are blunt and their timelines are slow. This leads to a reliance on moral language. When incentives fail, institutions appeal to duty, responsibility, and collective good. But moral appeals lose power when trust is low. People interpret them as attempts to extract compliance rather than genuine concern. The result is further disengagement. The feedback loop tightens. Disengagement weakens institutions. Weaker institutions offer less support. Reduced support increases individual burden. Increased burden accelerates disengagement. Breaking this loop requires intervention at the structural level, not the rhetorical one. Yet structural reform is difficult in constrained environments. Resources are limited, competing priorities abound, political will is fragmented, and any reform that genuinely reduces risk for one group often requires redistributing cost elsewhere, which invites resistance. This is why progress feels stalled, not because solutions are unknown, but because solutions are expensive, slow, and politically costly. In the absence of action, individuals continue adapting on their own. Men's adaptations, in particular, emphasize redundancy and self reliance. They build buffers where possible. They avoid debt. They limit obligations. They prefer arrangements that can be exited cleanly. These preferences influence everything from housing choices to social engagement. Over time, these patterns normalize. Younger men observe older peers living quietly stable lives and internalize those lessons early. The idea of opting out loses stigma as examples multiply. What was once framed as failure begins to look like prudence. This generational transmission is crucial. It means the shift is not self correcting, it compounds thus. Each cohort that adopts these strategies earlier does so with greater efficiency. The pool of men willing to re enter traditional frameworks shrinks further. Attempts to counter this trend by promoting nostalgia or idealized versions of the past fall flat. Younger generations did not experience those conditions. Appeals to restore something they never had lack emotional traction. Without tangible improvement, such appeals sound hollow. At the same time, technological change continues accelerating. Automation reshapes work. Digital platforms mediate interaction. Physical proximity becomes less necessary for many functions. These trends further reduce reliance on traditional social structures. None of this implies a future devoid of relationships or cooperation. It implies a future where participation is conditional and selective. People engage when terms are favorable and disengage when they are not. Loyalty becomes transactional rather than assumed. This represents a profound shift from previous eras. Social contracts once relied on obligation and expectation. The emerging model relies on choice and consent. While this increases individual freedom, it also increases instability. Systems built on obligation provided predictability. Systems built on choice must earn participation continuously. The challenge then is not to force engagement, but to make engagement worthwhile. This requires honesty about trade offs and humility about past mistakes. It requires acknowledging that previous arrangements imposed uneven costs. It requires redesigning frameworks to distribute risk more fairly. Whether this happens remains uncertain. What is clear is that men who have opted out will not return simply because conditions worsen for others. Hardship elsewhere does not negate the reasons they left. Sympathy does not override self preservation. This is the uncomfortable reality many are only beginning to accept. Rescue narratives no longer function. There is no cavalry arriving to restore balance. Each group must adapt to the environment as it exists, not as it was promised. As this acceptance spreads, the tone of public discourse may change. Less outrage, more resignation, less expectation of rescue, more emphasis on individual strategy. This may appear bleak, but it also carries potential for clarity. Clarity allows for realistic planning. It strips away illusions and forces confrontation with constraints. It encourages people to build lives that function under pressure rather than relying on assumptions of abundance. Men have already taken this step. They have accepted a narrower, quieter version of life in exchange for stability. They are not waiting for permission or validation. They are simply living within their means, both financially and emotionally. The rest of society is now being pushed toward a similar reckoning. The difference is timing. Early adapters had room to maneuver. Late adapters face tighter margins. This is not destiny. Conditions can improve. Systems can be reformed. Trust can be rebuilt. But none of that happens automatically, and none of it happens without cost. Until then, the pattern continues. Quiet withdrawal, incremental adjustment, expectations recalibrated downward, lives simplified, peace prioritized, and with each passing year, the distance between those who adapted early and those still clinging to old assumptions grows wider. That distance is the true divide shaping the future. As this divide widens, a subtle but powerful shift in social psychology takes hold. People begin to internalize a new baseline for what they expect from life, from others, and from institutions. Expectations that once felt normal start to feel unrealistic. Hopes that were once encouraged are quietly abandoned. This is not because people become cynical, but because experience teaches them what is viable and what is not. For men who have already disengaged, this recalibration has largely finished. They no longer plan their lives around external approval or future reconciliation. They assume continuity rather than rescue. They assume constraints rather than expansion. This assumption shapes decisions in ways that are not immediately visible but deeply consequential. One of the most important of these decisions concerns time. Time becomes the most valuable resource once material aspirations shrink. Men who opt out often report a heightened awareness of how their days are spent. Activities that drain energy without providing return are cut away. Obligations that exist solely to satisfy social expectation are minimized or eliminated. What remains is a schedule optimized for sustainability. This time, optimization feeds back into psychological stability. When days are predictable, stress decreases. When obligations are voluntary, resentment fades. When goals are self defined, motivation becomes intrinsic rather than imposed. These conditions reinforce disengagement from systems that threaten them. From the outside, this can look like withdrawal from ambition. In reality, ambition has simply been redirected. Rather than seeking scale, men seek efficiency. Rather than pursuing status, they pursue competence. Rather than building empires, they build buffers. These goals are quieter, but no less demanding. At the societal level, however, this quiet ambition poses a challenge. Systems designed to harness visible ambition struggle to engage those who no longer seek recognition. Rewards that once motivated participation lose their appeal. Titles, accolades, and symbolic gestures fall flat when material security and peace have already been secured. This creates a mismatch between what institutions offer and what individuals value. Institutions continue offering prestige and belonging. Individuals increasingly value autonomy and predictability. Until this mismatch is addressed, participation will remain low. Another underappreciated consequence of widespread disengagement is the erosion of informal support networks. In previous eras, even loosely connected communities provided a buffer against hardship. Neighbors helped neighbors. Extended families shared resources. Social expectations encouraged mutual aid. As participation declines, these networks weaken, not because people become unkind, but because engagement becomes conditional. When everyone is managing tight margins, generosity becomes risky. When trust is low, cooperation becomes cautious. The result is a more fragmented social landscape where individuals rely primarily on themselves. This fragmentation affects everyone, not just those who disengage. It increases vulnerability for those who lack buffers. It amplifies inequality of outcome based on timing and preparation. Those who adapted early fare better than those who adapt late. Women encountering this environment often experience a sharper shock because their expectations were shaped by a different narrative. Many were encouraged to prioritize self expression and independence under the assumption that support systems would remain intact. When those systems falter, the cost of misalignment becomes apparent. This does not mean women cannot adapt. Many do, but the adaptation required is more abrupt and more constrained. Downsizing later in life is harder than downsizing early. Adjusting expectations after investing heavily in a particular path carries emotional weight. The transition is not just logistical, but psychological. Men, having undergone a similar adjustment earlier, appear unmoved not because they lack empathy, but because they recognize the pattern. They see the same gap between promise and reality that they experienced. They know that no amount of reassurance can bridge that gap without structural change. This recognition creates a kind of emotional distance. Men observe rather than intervene. They offer advice if asked, but they do not volunteer rescue. They have learned that stepping in often reintroduces the very dynamics they exited. Maintaining boundaries becomes a form of self preservation. From a cultural standpoint, this challenges long-standing assumptions about gender roles. Men were once expected to absorb instability on behalf of others. They were socialized to prioritize provision over personal well-being. That expectation is now being rejected en masse. The rejection is not loud, but it is firm. It manifests as refusal to overextend, refusal to absorb disproportionate risk, refusal to shoulder responsibility without authority. These refusals accumulate into a systemic shift. As this shift becomes more visible, narratives adjust. Media outlets begin discussing loneliness and demographic decline. Policymakers express concern about family formation. Commentators speculate about cultural decay. Yet much of this commentary treats symptoms rather than causes. The cause remains misaligned incentives. Without addressing risk distribution, no amount of concern will restore participation. People do not engage with systems that penalize them for doing so. Another factor complicating the situation is generational memory. Younger men have grown up observing instability as the norm. They witnessed financial crises, institutional failures, and shifting social expectations from an early age. For them, caution is not learned behavior, it is default behavior. This generational perspective accelerates disengagement. Younger men do not need to experience loss firsthand to internalize risk. They see the outcomes around them and adjust preemptively. This makes the trend self reinforcing. In contrast, institutions often operate on generational timelines that assume continuity. They plan for outcomes based on historical patterns rather than emerging realities. This lag creates friction. By the time institutions respond, Individuals have already moved on. This lag is evident in policy debates that assume incentives alone can reverse trends. Tax benefits, subsidies, and messaging campaigns are proposed as solutions. While these may help at the margins, they do not address the core issue of trust. Trust is built through consistency and fairness over time. It cannot be purchased or mandated. It requires systems to demonstrate reliability across cycles of success and failure. In an environment of frequent disruption, this demonstration is difficult. Men who have disengaged do not expect perfection. They expect predictability. They expect rules that are applied evenly. They expect consequences to be proportionate. When these expectations are not met, disengagement feels justified. This expectation of predictability extends beyond relationships into work and governance. Men who opt out of traditional social roles often also reduce exposure to unstable employment and volatile markets. They favor steady income over speculative opportunity. They choose simplicity over scale. These choices further reduce their visibility within traditional success narratives. They do not appear as high achievers or strivers. They appear average, even though their internal metrics tell a different story. This invisibility reinforces misunderstanding. From the outside, it looks like stagnation. From the inside, it feels like equilibrium. As equilibrium becomes the goal rather than growth, the pace of life slows. This has psychological benefits, but economic implications. Slower consumption reduces demand. Reduced demand affects employment. Employment instability feeds back into individual caution. This is another feedback loop that resists easy intervention. Encouraging spending without addressing security simply increases anxiety. People spend when they feel safe, not when they are told to. The same principle applies to relationships. People commit when they feel secure, not when they are pressured. Commitment under pressure breeds resentment and instability. Men have learned this lesson through experience, and as a result, they are willing to accept smaller lives if those lives are stable. This acceptance marks a departure from narratives of endless aspiration. It suggests a cultural shift toward sufficiency rather than abundance. Whether this shift is ultimately beneficial or harmful is a matter of perspective. It reduces strain on individuals, but challenges systems built on growth. It increases autonomy, but weakens collective structures. It offers peace, but limits scale. The trade offs are real and unavoidable. What is clear is that the old equilibrium is gone. The assumptions that once guided planning no longer hold. Attempting to restore them without acknowledging their failure only deepens disillusionment. The path forward, if one exists, requires confronting uncomfortable truths. It requires admitting that previous arrangements imposed uneven costs. It requires redistributing risk in ways that feel fair. It requires patience to rebuild trust slowly. Absent these steps, disengagement will continue. Not because people are hostile, but because they are rational. Men will continue to choose peace over pressure, simplicity over spectacle, control over chaos. These choices are not reversible through persuasion alone. They are responses to an environment that taught them repeatedly that participation carried too high a price. Until that environment changes in substance rather than tone, the quiet withdrawal will remain the dominant strategy. And with each year that passes, it will feel less like withdrawal and more like the new normal. As this new normal settles in, the most striking feature is how ordinary it begins to feel to those living inside it. What once would have been described as extreme or antisocial quietly becomes routine. A man living alone by choice, with limited obligations, modest needs, and a tightly controlled schedule, no longer appears unusual. He appears practical, he appears prepared, he appears calm in a world that feels anything but. This normalization matters because social change becomes irreversible once it loses its sense of novelty. Resistance fades when there is nothing left to argue against. People stop asking why and start asking how. How do I make this work? How do I protect myself? How do I adapt before my options narrow further? These questions mark the transition from denial to acceptance. In this phase, the language of the discussion subtly changes. Moral arguments give way to logistical ones. Instead of debating what should happen, people begin calculating what can happen. Instead of appealing to ideals, they focus on constraints. This shift often feels colder, but it is also more honest. For men, this honesty has already reshaped daily behavior. Financial decisions become conservative by default. Long term commitments are scrutinized not for their symbolism, but for their exit costs. Social engagements are filtered through the lens of energy expenditure. Anything that introduces volatility without clear benefit is avoided. This approach is often misunderstood as selfishness. In reality, it is boundary setting in an environment that punishes overextension. When margins are thin, generosity becomes a liability. When systems are unreliable, self reliance becomes essential. These are not character flaws, they are survival strategies. As these strategies spread, the collective rhythm of society changes. There is less urgency, fewer people rushing toward milestones they no longer believe in. The pace slows, not because people have lost drive, but because they have lost faith in certain outcomes. This slowdown exposes another uncomfortable reality. Many of the pressures that once held society together were artificial. They relied on fear of exclusion, fear of judgment, fear of falling behind. When men disengage from these fears, the pressure dissipates. What remains is a quieter, more fragmented landscape where participation must be earned rather than assumed. This earning of participation is where many institutions struggle. They were designed to command attention, not compete for it. They expect compliance based on authority rather than value. When faced with individuals who can walk away without immediate penalty, their leverage weakens. In response, some institutions attempt to escalate pressure. They warn of consequences. They emphasize duty. They frame disengagement as harmful to others. These tactics may sway those still emotionally invested, but they have little effect on those who have already detached. Other institutions attempt adaptation. They simplify offerings. They reduce barriers. They acknowledge past failures cautiously. These efforts sometimes succeed at the margins, but they are constrained by legacy structures that resist deep reform. The result is uneven progress. Small pockets of alignment emerge while the broader system remains misaligned. Individuals navigate this patchwork environment pragmatically, taking what works and ignoring the rest. For women, this environment demands rapid reassessment. Many are forced to confront a reality where autonomy carries higher costs than anticipated. The freedom to choose comes bundled with the responsibility to absorb risk alone. This realization is jarring, especially when it arrives later in life. Some respond by recalibrating expectations downward. They reduce living standards. They prioritize security over aspiration. They adopt strategies similar to those men adopted earlier. This adaptation can restore stability, but it requires letting go of narratives that once provided identity and purpose. Others resist this recalibration. They cling to the belief that conditions will improve or that solutions will appear externally. This resistance often leads to prolonged stress as reality continues to diverge from expectation. The divergence in outcomes among women grows. reflecting differences in timing, resources, and flexibility. Those who adapt early fare better. Those who adapt late face steeper adjustments. This mirrors the pattern observed among men years earlier. Men observing this divergence often feel a mix of recognition and distance. They see familiar patterns, but remain unwilling to reinsert themselves into unstable dynamics. Their priority remains preservation of equilibrium. This preservation is not passive, it requires ongoing effort. Maintaining a low exposure lifestyle in a high pressure environment demands discipline. It means resisting cultural cues that encourage overreach. It means saying no more often than yes. It means accepting social friction in exchange for internal stability. Over time, this discipline becomes habit. Habits shape identity. Identity reinforces behavior. The longer this cycle continues, the less likely reversal becomes. This is why calls for collective solutions often fail to resonate. Collective solutions imply shared risk and shared obligation. For those who have learned to minimize risk by limiting obligation, such proposals feel threatening rather than reassuring. Trust would need to be rebuilt before collective frameworks could function again. Trust requires evidence that systems will not exploit participation. It requires transparency, consistency, and fairness across time. These qualities are scarce in an environment defined by rapid change and resource constraint. Without trust, individuals default to self management. They focus on what they can control. They reduce exposure to what they cannot. This approach is rational, but it leaves little room for grand projects or sweeping reforms. As a result, the future appears smaller in scope but more grounded. Fewer people chasing improbable outcomes, more people building lives that can endure pressure. This shift may reduce innovation and growth, but it increases resilience. Resilience becomes the dominant value in uncertain environments. It favors redundancy over efficiency, simplicity over complexity, flexibility over optimization. Men who have opted out embody this shift. Their lives are not immune to hardship, but they are structured to absorb it. They have fewer dependencies, fewer points of failure, fewer obligations that cannot be renegotiated. This structure provides psychological safety, even when external conditions deteriorate. This psychological safety is difficult to surrender once achieved. It explains why appeals to return fall flat. Returning would mean reintroducing uncertainty without guarantee of improvement. From the perspective of someone who has stabilized their life, this is an irrational gamble. Meanwhile, society continues grappling with the consequences of widespread disengagement. Declining household formation affects housing markets. Reduced consumption affects employment. Lower birth rates affect long term planning. Each consequence feeds into the next. These challenges prompt calls for intervention, but intervention without alignment risks exacerbating distrust. People are wary of solutions that impose new obligations without addressing old grievances. They prefer incremental change they can evaluate over time. This preference slows reform but increases scrutiny. Systems are no longer given the benefit of the doubt. They must demonstrate value repeatedly. This is exhausting for institutions accustomed to deference. Yet this scrutiny also creates an opportunity. Systems that genuinely adapt can regain participation gradually. Those that reduce risk, clarify rules, and distribute responsibility fairly can attract cautious re-engagement. The process would be slow and uneven, but not impossible. The key obstacle is acknowledgement. Acknowledging that the old model failed is politically and culturally difficult. It challenges identities built around moral certainty. It forces admission of unintended harm. Many resist the step, preferring to frame disengagement as a moral lapse rather than a rational response. As long as disengagement is framed as deviance, reconciliation remains unlikely. People do not return to systems that pathologize their self protection. Men understand this instinctively. It reinforces their decision to remain outside. They are not interested in vindication, they are interested in stability. This focus on stability over validation marks a profound shift in social dynamics. It deprioritizes narrative control. It prioritizes lived experience. It renders many debates irrelevant. The most important changes now happen quietly at the level of individual choice: where to live, how much to spend, who to trust. These choices accumulate into patterns that shape society more powerfully than any public argument, and those patterns continue moving in the same direction: toward smaller lives, toward tighter boundaries, toward self reliance, toward peace as a primary goal. This does not mean the future is bleak, it means it is different. It means fewer illusions and fewer guarantees. It means more responsibility placed on individuals and less absorbed by institutions. Men have already adjusted to this reality. Others are still in the process. The longer that process takes, the more entrenched the new equilibrium becomes. At some point, it stops feeling like adaptation and starts feeling like common sense. That is the stage society is approaching now. As this stage is reached, what becomes impossible to ignore is that the old assumptions are no longer guiding behavior at any meaningful scale. The idea that discomfort will naturally push people back into traditional arrangements has proven false. Hardship does not automatically generate cooperation. In many cases, it accelerates withdrawal. When people experience repeated instability, their instinct is not to lean outward, but to pull inward and secure what they can control. This is where the final misunderstanding often occurs. Many assume that worsening conditions will force men back into partnerships out of necessity, but necessity only drives behavior when alternatives are worse. For men who have structured their lives around low dependency, worsening external conditions reinforce their choices rather than undermine them. Chaos outside the boundary makes the boundary feel more valuable. This is why the current moment feels so disorienting to those who expected a reversal. The pressure points are inverted. The harder the environment becomes, the less attractive high exposure arrangements appear. What once functioned as an incentive now functions as a warning. At this point, the discussion must move beyond emotion and narrative and return to fundamentals. Every society rests on a balance between contribution and reward. When that balance holds, participation feels natural. When it breaks, participation must be coerced or incentivized. Coercion breeds resistance. Incentives fail when trust is gone. Men did not disengage because they were confused about what was being asked of them. They disengaged because they understood it clearly and found it unsustainable. Reframing the request without changing its substance does nothing. This is the quiet truth that now shapes everything downstream. The withdrawal is not temporary. It is not a protest. It is a permanent adjustment to new conditions. Men have recalibrated their expectations, their commitments, and their definitions of a good life. Those calibrations are now embedded in habit, routine, and identity. Identity matters here more than most people realize. When a man stops seeing himself as a role player in a larger social script and starts seeing himself as a self contained unit responsible for his own stability, his decision making changes fundamentally. He no longer measures choices by how they fit into a shared narrative. He measures them by how they affect his equilibrium. Once this shift occurs, appeals to duty lose traction, appeals to guilt fail outright. The only language that resonates is risk and return. If engagement does not improve outcomes, it is ignored. This does not mean men are closed to cooperation. It means cooperation must be voluntary, bounded, and fair. It must reduce risk rather than concentrate it. It must be reversible rather than binding. These conditions are rarely met by traditional frameworks, which were designed for an era of abundance and shared trust. As a result, what emerges is not a society without connection, but a society with different forms of connection, looser networks, fewer permanent ties, more conditional engagement, relationships based on mutual benefit rather than obligation. This model lacks the stability of the old one, but it reflects current realities more accurately. For women, the full weight of this shift is still being processed. Many are now facing a future where fallback plans no longer exist. The expectation that someone else will step in has eroded. The realization that independence requires infrastructure has arrived late and often under pressure. This creates a painful reckoning. It forces choices that feel unfair precisely because they were not anticipated. It reveals how much of modern life depended on assumptions that were never guaranteed. And it exposes the cost of delayed adaptation. Some women will adapt successfully, just as some men did earlier. They will simplify, they will prioritize stability, they will adjust expectations to fit constraints. Others will struggle longer, caught between narratives that no longer apply and realities that demand change. Men, having already passed through this phase, will largely remain observers, not out of indifference, but out of self preservation. They understand that re entering unstable dynamics reintroduces the very risks they work to eliminate. They choose distance not because they lack compassion, but because they value equilibrium. This is the part of the story that is hardest for many to accept. There is no rescue arc. There is no moment where men collectively decide to step back into old roles to stabilize the system. That chapter is closed. What replaces it is a slower, more fragmented process of adjustment. Institutions scale down expectations. Individuals rely more heavily on personal strategy. Communities shrink and localize. The future becomes less grand but more manageable. This transition is uncomfortable because it strips away illusions. It forces confrontation with limits. It requires accepting that some doors have closed permanently, but it also opens a different kind of possibility. Lives designed for resilience rather than display. Success measured by sustainability rather than status. Men who have opted out are already living this reality. Their lives are not glamorous, they are not immune to hardship, but they are structured to endure. That endurance is the quiet advantage that now shapes outcomes. As society continues adjusting, the rhetoric will keep evolving. There will be renewed calls for unity, for shared sacrifice, for collective rebuilding. Some of these calls will be sincere, some will be desperate, but without changes to risk distribution, they will continue to miss their target. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. People protect themselves when systems fail to protect them. Men learned this lesson early. Others are learning it now that there is no villain in the story. There is no single cause. There is only a long chain of incentives and responses, promises and outcomes, actions and adaptations. The result is the world we are now inhabiting. And understanding this does not require agreement, it requires honesty. The path forward, if one exists, will be built slowly through credibility rather than coercion, through reform rather than rhetoric, through fairness rather than expectation. It will require patience measured in decades, not election cycles. Until then, the dominant strategy remains unchanged. Men continue to choose peace over pressure, simplicity over chaos, control over obligation. These choices are not loud, but they are decisive. And that is the final point that cannot be avoided. The most powerful movements of this era are not driven by slogans or demands. They are driven by absence, by refusal, by quiet decisions made in private spaces, repeated millions of times. That is how societies change. Before we close this out, I want to give a shout out to the 1 hour gang who stayed to the very end of this video and made it all the way through. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with this analysis? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation is not going away. Like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.